Mike Bailey is called the Jerome Clock Collector. He has a website. If you haven't been to it and you have a Jerome, recommend you do. When I gave my first speech on steeple clocks, he and his wife Kitty came down from Omaha, and he brought a couple of clocks. Really, really nice guy and very smart. You know Scott Childs, obviously you know Chris Bailey, Bill Isles, some of the others. Lee Davis, you might know him. Great group of people. What is an oversized steeple? Well, that's these four steeples right here. They're 22.5 inches tall, as opposed to 19 3/4, 20 inch for a standard. The finial height is 3 7/8 compared to a 3 inch for a standard steeple. The dials have a mid-sized central opening of 1 inch, and I'll show you that later, compared to a standard one that is only 3/8, or one with an alarm setting disc, which is 1 inch and 5/8. They were only made by Chauncey Jerome sometime after he went to business in New Haven in 1845, after the fire in Bristol. There's a guy named John Taylor in there from the UK that said that these oversized were made just for the UK. And I can't imagine Jerome made anything just for one place. They converted 30-hour and 8-day OG weight movements, and there's 4 different movements with this. They're all rare. I am writing an article for National Bulletin on these 4 clocks. No one's had all 4 of them, and I had pictures of it. John Taylor did write an article, but he had 3 of them, but didn't have the one on the second one from the right. Here's a picture of all 4, and we'll look at each one individually and up close. Here's a picture with the dial off and the doors open, so you can see the 4 different movements. First 2 are fusees. First is 8 day, second the 30 hour. The third one, there's only 3 of those known. And the 4th one's a 4-day, and we're going to talk about that, and you can think, why would you make a 4-day, and how do you remember when to wind it? Both good questions. Okay, this is the 8-day, and you can see that 1 inch.
It's on the wall back there.
No. Okay, it's not showing on there. It's right there. Doesn't project off to that, so it doesn't work. That's a 1 inch opening, and just to be able to see it, and you can see the brass dust covers, and we'll talk about that. So it's an 8-day. It's a type 1.13, and Taylor Snowden came up with a numbering system, and so you can look at a movement and see what it is. It's got riveted and pinned extension legs. It's got 4 rivets and then a pin in the center. Steel springs, and they're behind iron spools, and the fusee cones are mounted as part of the first wheel. And the brass dust covers are 2 5/8 inches, and you'll see it smaller when you get to the 30 hour. That's the 30 hour, and you see, well, one, you're missing a row of gears, and you see the dust cover is a lot smaller. That is called a fake fusee, and there's discussion on that, and I think you need to be an engineer to figure out really if there is any fusee movement in it. And we'll talk about that in more detail. So it's a 30 hour, it's a type 1.311. Again, you have the riveted pinned extension legs, steel springs behind the wooden spools. And the wooden spools are just very slightly tapered, So do they provide any equalizing power? Outstanding question. The steel springs are nailed to the seat board and the brass dust covers are only 1.5 inches compared to 2 5/8. And here's a side by side so you can see and notice the difference in the movements. The die stamps on the movements are Chauncey Jerome, New Haven, Connecticut, USA. And you're going, why would they say that? One could believe that they're for export and so they came from the U.S. Here's an example. You can see the fusee cone with the grooves on it, and then you've got a gut on it, and then you can see the iron spool right behind that brass dust cover, and the springs are behind it, and I have another picture to show that better in a second. On the brass tapering winding drum, it's all wrapped up. It's slightly tapered, and that wooden spool is slightly tapered, and they're going in opposite directions. So you can see the spool on the 8-day on the left, and on the right you can see the wooden spool on the 30-hour and the brass drum where the spool tapers, and it is slight, but there is some tapering. Is that amount of tapering enough to provide the equalizing of a fusee? And I don't know. I'm not an engineer, and I don't know when I can ask that question, because you have to do some measurements, I'm sure. I said earlier that they're fastened to the seat board by a nail, and you can see examples of each of them where the nail is securing the end of the spring. On the 8-day on the left, you can see the iron spool, and then the brass dust covers to the left, and the spring, steel spring, is to the right. That's another reason that they waited till they got steel springs, because people in the UK had a real aversion to brass springs. So they wanted steel springs. And again, you can see the brass tapered winding drum where it doesn't show much, and the slightly tapered wooden spool. Labels. I just learned something this month, and that made me do some additional research. The one on the left is the 8-day, and that's mine. And I call it a full-size label. Covers the whole thing. And you have the arch at the top. On the right is the 30-hour, quote, fake fusee, and patent brass clocks with steel mainsprings, so they're emphasizing the steel mainsprings instead of brass, manufactured by Chauncey Jerome, New Haven. The 30-hour in oversized steeples, they made them in other clocks, cases. To my knowledge, all of them have that tan 3 line. Now, yeah, tan 3 line. I since, up in Kansas City, found one that belonged to a guy that brought it to their August program, or August meeting, which I gave a program on, that has the same, has a 3-line tan label. But it's not like the 30-hour. It says patent 8-day brass clocks with steel mainsprings. So which one's more common? I looked at 12 that I could easily identify. Some doors were shut and you can't tell. Of those 12, one has the full blue label, and it has no board for support. And you can see a wooden board right above those brass drums. And that wooden board is put in there, I think, for the sole purpose of supporting the dial. You've got a screw up at the top, and then you got the board at the bottom. You don't have any pins or anything to hold it. It just sits on that board. And mine doesn't have the board. But it has the blue label, and it's the only one that had it. 3 of them had the 3-line tan label with a board support. 7 had the 3-line tan label with no board. And 1 had a 3-line blue label with a board, and that was from the UK. So did they make it different for the UK? I don't have a big enough sample to tell. One could think, if you're working on clocks, how do you get to that movement with that board there? You're going to have to take the board out, and it slides in on one end and then you pull it out. Well, doing that very often, A, would break it, and 2, you get tired messing with it, so you leave it out. That's what I think happened. Both the 8-day and the 30-hour have holes in the bottom. How many people look at the bottom of a clock to see what's on there? I did and found those. George Siegel wrote an article in the December 2014 bulletin that it was on fashion calendar clocks, and in it it showed on the bottom holes on the bottom, and they said it's used for putting them in crates to be shipped instead of putting on the back of a wagon or tie it onto a pack mule or something. And so you had those to sit on it, and then you had some kind of something hanging down, probably on the steeple, to keep it from rocking back and forth. I was happy with that until Bill Dugan contacted me and said, well, I measured mine. And I went, you did? Okay. If you look on the left on the 8-day, the front's on the top. It is close to the holes are closer to the bottom than they are to the top. If you look on the 30-hour, they're closer to the top than the bottom. His 8-day, they're closer to the top than the bottom. So did they stack them in there? They put them back to back, back to front to front, and the answer's, I have no clue. One would think they'd put them back to back, but how many did they put in a crate? Don't know. Of the 4 oversized steeples, those 2 are the only ones with holes in the bottom. On the fake fusees, they can be found in 4 different cases. Oversized steeple, already talked about that. A miniature Empire case with a blockier case. A miniature Empire, and I'm going to show you that, and a miniature OG. And I'll have examples of each of those in the article that I'm writing. Here's just a gorgeous clock. It's got mahogany on the outside, on the door frame, and bird's eye maple around the outside. And it's that 30-hour fake fusee. You can tell by the 1.5-inch diameter dust covers is one of the first clues. Okay, this is the 3rd example of an oversized steeple. The iron spools are located down at the bottom, and they're attached to the bottom with a bracket. And at the very bottom of the bracket, you'll see a little tip that's broken off, and there's only 3 documented of this type of clock. This one came from Ken Roberts' collection, and in his book on contribution of Ives and early clockmakers, it says author's collection. And I bought it from Bill Mather, who bought it from Ken Roberts. Here's a close-up of the label where you can see that overpaste, and you can't have, I don't think you can have 2 clocks with an overpaste torn out like that on 2 different clocks. I think that's hard to believe. And so that's one of the ways you can tell if it's that same clock. The other thing you'll notice is that these clocks came from OG clocks, weight driven, so they're taller cases. Well, how do you adjust for that? You change the number of teeth in the escape wheel, and or you hang the pendulum from the eave of the case. If you hang it from the eave like this one does, they also make a standard, Jerome also made a standard size 30-hour with the pendulum hung in the eave like that. If you look at the back, it's got a bunch of holes in the back of the case. I have no clue. A very smart person said, man, that back of that case is holier than the Pope. No disrespect meant. But there's a lot of holes and cutouts there, and I don't know. That rare clock, I'm going to live with it. When I bought the clock in '82, that's the way it looked. And it had a fusee on it. A wooden fusee, looks like it's new. And it doesn't match the picture of the one in Ken Roberts' book or any of the others. And when I gave this program in Kansas City at their River City Regional in March, the night before, Mike Bailey, who's the Jerome guy, and I were talking about this. He says, well, have you ever thought about pulling the fusees off? What do you have underneath it on? Yeah, I don't know. So a good friend of mine volunteered to help me with that, and I can't remember Scott's name. He did, and we got to this. Now, a couple things that you'll notice on the right, looking at the side. One, there's a hole in the base arbor. Why would you have a hole if you're not going to use it? You would have it to run a gut or cord through that, tie a knot, and then it would wrap around it. Well, it'd start wrapping from the inside, from the back of it, towards the front. But as you go to the front, you should have some kind of cord catcher, collar, something to keep the cord from running off. Because if it runs off, the teeth on the second gear are just going to slice it up, and that's going to be worthless. So, don't know. And there are no pictures of any other clock with this movement, because I can't get any, and guess I'm trying. Here is that brass, or that cast iron frame at the bottom. You can see that broken tip at the bottom, and someone, being smart, took chalk or something and marked arrows on which way to wind those springs. And then the picture on the right shows the back of it. Okay, this is a side, and you can see that that is slightly tapered. Not much, but a little. And you remember that brass arbor, it didn't have any tapering at all. So this might be more accurate to be called a fake fusee, except there's not enough out there for people to really know. On the right, you'll see the little hook or nail that's sticking out of that inside where the spring hooks on. Okay, this is my clock on the left. You can see the overpaste, and then the one on the right is from Roberts. You can see the overpaste. You can see that there's no wooden fusees, and you can see that little tip on the bottom bracket that's broken. And on that, it also says Author's Collection. And that's in the first edition, not in the second. This is Chris Bailey's in Rags to Riches, and it's the same clock. You got the same broken tip on the bracket, you got the same overpaste, and it was from, if you look at in the Rags to Riches book, it says the Edward Ingram Library. Well, that is the Bristol Museum's library, and the guy that photographed the clocks, Ed Goodrich, also photographed many of Ken Roberts. This is John Taylor's article in Horological Journal, October of '98, which, when I came to this epiphany last year that Jerome's the only one that made these oversized steeples, and they only came in 4 different models or different movements. Afterwards, a couple months ago, I found out that he wrote an article in '98 saying that there's 4. My article is going to go a little bit more depth than his. But a great guy, I've communicated with him. Okay, so mine's on the left. The one in Schaefer, supplement 9, is on the right. The wood graining is different, and that bracket doesn't have the tip broken at the bottom. So you can tell those two are different examples. So there's 2 examples. This clock on the left was at a Bourne auction in 1986. From research, my understanding, it was bought by a Dr. Martin Baker from Hattiesburg, and he did a lot of work to the case, and it obviously looks a lot better. You can see it has the same tablet, same dial, same graining. And he sold it in 2003. There's stories on who actually bought it and where it is now, and I haven't been able to get any information on that one. There's an example of that one to mine. The first thing you notice is the tablets are different, the dials are different, and the graining's different. So that's the third example. I don't have a picture of this with the door open, but Paul Degman was there and said that he saw it, and it was one of those. This is the 4th one. It's a 4-day. Why do you have a 4-day? And the answer, I don't know. I know of 10 of these, less than 10 of these, that I can document here in the United States. John Taylor says he knows of 10 in the UK, so my math says that's pretty close to 20. Not very many. And again, why would they make them? They would be expensive, and I don't think very practical. Look at the tablet, and you'll notice the tablet on every one of these, and I hadn't pointed out before, they're rectangular. They're skinnier up and down because they're taller. And that's going to come up in a second. So here's a picture of the 4-day movement. Great big brass springs. Got a brass dust cover. How effective are those is a good question. And I told you that in UK, they didn't want brass springs. They wanted steel springs. This is kind of unique. Made by Chauncey Jerome, and it would say Bristol, Connecticut, or New Haven, or you'd have some city there. There's no city. So where was it made, and why doesn't it happen? Well, there's an article in the Bulletin by Mike Bailey and Snowden Taylor on what they think happened. And they think that when the fire of April 23rd, 1845 happened in Jerome's in Bristol, you start throwing stuff outside. You want to save movements, you want to save gears, you want to save case. You just want to get stuff out of the building so it doesn't burn up, and then you can use it again when you set up later. They think they did that, and then they took the die stamp, filed off Bristol, because they're no longer in Bristol, they're now in New Haven, and that's probably one of the earliest ones. Improved 4-day. Spring clocks, manufactured and sold by Chauncey Jerome, New Haven. Now, the reason I said look at the size of the tablet, this is an advertisement a few years prior to 1850. And so you see the two clocks, you can see the advertisement on the left. On the right, you can see a steel spring fusee, 8 and Dave Gothic strike. Is that a 1 or a 4? Same thing for the Union, which is to the left of that. And I would suggest to you that on the Steeple, that's a 1 and not a 4, for the simple reason there's no height on anything there. But look at the tablet. That tablet looks pretty square. It doesn't look rectangle. So the conclusion is Chauncey Jerome's the only one that made them. They're slightly more than 3 inches taller than the standard eyes. Had a variety of movements, 4 of them. and they were conceived as an imposing spring-driven design aimed at the English market. And each of these clocks are rare. What is a steeple on steeple? That's the next group of 4 clocks that you can look over and see. The height is between 23 1/4 and 27 1/4. It's called a steeple on steeple, steeple on frame, double steeple, twin steeple. You have people using different names. They came with 4 movements, an 8-day spring made by different people, 8-day double fusee, attached or detached, made by different people, Burge and Fuller 30-hour movement with an Ives cantilever wagon spring, and a Burge and Fuller 8-day movement with an Ives cantilever wagon spring. Here's an example of all 4. The one on the left is a William S. Johnson. The Manrose is the second one. And then the Burge and Fuller 30-hour and 8-day wagon springs. Here's a picture with the dials off and the doors open. And we'll look at each one individually. Okay, this is William Johnson. Boy, that's a cool maker. There aren't very many of those around. He's a neat clock maker. Well, I'm glad you think that. He's a case maker. He's not even a case maker. He's an assembler. I don't think he made cases. I think someone else made the cases. He had someone else do the tablets. If you look at the tablets, most of them have Americana type thing, stars and stripes. It's got an eagle. That blue background's pretty common with William Johnson. And the movement's a Jerome. And you can tell by looking it up, and it's the same movement as that. Label says William S. Johnson, manufactured by William S. Johnson, number 49 Cortlandt Street, New York, warranted if well used. He also made a few steeples, a few 4-column New York style clocks, and even fewer steeple on steeples. So having that in a steeple on steeples, a little unique. And he was a retailer of clocks. This one's just kind of a cute clock for a lot of reasons. It's Eliza Manross. It's a double steeple. It's 8-day double fusee. And if you look at it, and I wish my laser doesn't show. Look at it with the lights on. You'll see one print from here to here, and another one from here to here. So here covers 2/3, and that covers 1/3. And why did they do that? Because they did the first one that wasn't big enough. I've seen others with that. Another guy's got one very similar. But if you look close, the painting on the ships are slightly different colors. But look at that, because that's just kind of unique. This is strap brass movement. You don't see too many of those in spring-driven clocks. They were earlier, they were weight-driven, and then you can see the fusees down below in the wooden blocks. Just a cute clock. Label says patented spring 8-day brass clocks made and sold by Eliza Manross, Bristol, Connecticut. And then the printer. And the reason for knowing the printer, that helps you date clocks. When was it made? Well, you know, this guy was in business from so-and-so to so-and-so. Look at the date for the printer and what the dates are for that location. This is a 30-hour Burge and Fuller. That's a typical Burge and Fuller 30-hour Pierce fancy lyre shaped plates identified as a Burge and Fuller, but it's not stamped, it's not marked. But you can look at that and tell that's a Burge and Fuller. There's the wagon springs, and from that I want you to take how it's set up. It's 30-hour, and one of the ways to tell that is how many leaf springs you have, and there's 3. And you will notice with Burge and Fuller, it's got a square nut holding those springs down, those leaf springs. and the intermediate wheels at the top are power transfers or torque converters, and the diameters 2 3/4. They are smaller than the ones for the 8-day, so you can't trade them out. Now, I showed you that square-headed bolt that went down. Well, it's got a hook to something. Well, it hooks to a cast iron anchoring base that hangs down. Well, if you do that, you can't set it on it, so you need 4 bund feet to get it off the ground or off the table or whatever. And that little anchoring base is 4 inches by 1 inch. But that's why you have bund feet. So most cases, not all, if you see 4 bund feet, you probably have a wagon spring. There's the label. J. Ives patent accelerating lever spring, 30-hour brass clocks, made and sold for made and sale for sale, wholesale, and retail by Burgeon Fuller, Bristol, Connecticut. This is not when he first made wagon springs. He made them in New York before that. They were too expensive and they didn't sell very well. And Burgeon Fuller had made these oversized steeple on steeples so that he can house that. Here's an 8-day. Movement stamped, Burgeon Fuller. The power converter here, those torque converters are 3 3/8 compared to 2 and something on the 30-hour. And there's 7 steel leaf springs compared to 3 for the 30-hour. There's a lot of torque. You wind that puppy up. And if you got more torque, you need a bigger cast iron anchoring base, and that base is 8 by 2, and again you can see the 4 bund feet. Again, Joseph Ives patent accelerating equalizing lever spring. I think now you can tell why we call it a wagon spring. A lot easier to say. Here's comparing the 30-hour and the 8-day. You can see the difference in the number of leaf springs. Probably can't tell the difference in the torque converters. Again, notice the square heads, headed bolts. And again, the 30-hour has a 4 by 1 inch anchoring base, and the 8-day has an 8 by 2, twice as big. What is a giant OG steeple? Well, it's these 3 right here. They have no finials. It's an OG molding on the sides and on the pitch. They've got a beveled outside edge along the back of the case. A 2-inch solid wood base. And there's only, here's 3, there's only 6 of these cases known. There are 2 in the 8-day. There's 1 in the 30-hour wagon spring. And there's 3 in a J.A. Wells wagon spring. And so that's the 6. Here's a picture of all 3. Here's a picture with the dial off and the doors open, so you can see an 8-day spring on the left, wagon spring in the center, and a wagon spring on the right. And you can tell the difference in height. Who's John Hunt? He's a cabinet maker. He lived in Plainsville, section of Farmington, which was referred to as Bristol Basin. He did business with Joseph Ives and Hills and Goodrich, also with Joseph Wells. He's not a clock maker. He's a case maker, and undoubtedly traded cases for movements, as you can see that in the movements here. He also made a 30-hour, housed a 30-hour movement in a half-round side and cornice case and a column and splat. And he also made wooden movements for our column and splat. Okay, here's the 8-day. This is from Doug Schaefer's collection. So it's in supplement 9, and that's his clock that I ended up buying when he sold part of his collection. It's one of two known, and I know the person that has the other one. Early American collector, great guy, lives back east, and we communicate all the time. I learned a lot from him. Here's the movement. Who made the movement? It's a Wells and Hendricks. Wells, Joseph Wells, and Ebenezer Hendrick. This was after Boardman and Wells from 1832 to 43. And what they did is take a weight-driven OG movement and put springs in it. Well, if you put springs in it and you put the springs on that same arbor, your spring's going to come out. So what he did is you look down at the bottom on that first gear, what it looks like, that's a count wheel. Well, that should be right on a count wheel for a strike side. But you got a count wheel over here. So he just took gears, took the wheels off of it to protect the springs to keep them from expanding. Now, this label's kind of interesting. 8-day spring clock. John Hunt. Well, why is that interesting? Well, you look closely. On the left, it tells you the light weights on the striking side of the clock. To wind the weights, put the key in the handle down and turn toward figure 7. They don't know clockwise and counterclockwise, I guess. Steadily until the weight is up. Why are you telling us to put the weights up if it's an 8-day spring movement? Probably a little hasty in putting that together. Okay, this is mine on the left. It has a tablet of the State House of Hartford. On the right is the Public Square of New Haven, and it's on Horology Americana, and that's the second clock with the 8-day spring movement. This is the 30-hour wagon spring, and to my knowledge, it's the only one that's known. The movement is stamped C. Boardman, Bristol, Connecticut. Patent January 1847. And what you'll notice is that looks very similar to what would be in a double fusee that was made by Boardman and Wells. Here's the wagon spring. It's got the square-headed bolt. It's got the 3 leaves. So it's obviously 30-hour. If it's 30-hour wagon spring, you've got that 4 by 1 inch cast iron anchoring base, and you got the 4 bun feet. Here's a picture of the corner, which shows that OG molding, which is, I think, kind of cute. It's got round pegs in it at the bottom. It's got 2 of the 4 wooden bun feet, and it's got a beveled outside edge on the backboard. Now, we talked about the label, and that label looks the same, because it is. So you have a label that says it's an 8-day spring that tells you how to wind the weights, that's housing a 30-hour wagon spring. So you got 3 different things, and they don't agree with each other. Now, this same clock, and you're going, that's not the same clock, was in Horology Rarities Space City in 1999 at the National Convention. And you're saying, well, that tablet's not the same. And it's not. And I have it right here so you can look at it. It was made, Terry Brotherton, let's back up. Phil Gregory saw this clock for sale, and he goes, man, that's a weird duck. I've never seen anything like it. So he went off to find Ken Roberts. Ken, I got a clock I need you to see and tell me about it. And as he's walking back to it, as he gets to it, Terry Brotherton's handing over money to buy it. So it had some kind of bad tablet in it, and Phil Gregory said, I will make you this etched eagle tablet. And he did. And I'll tell you why he did that in just a second. But if you look at these three, that's original. I mean, it's all flaking. That's original. I believe that's original. Those three go together, and so that kind of tablet, I think, goes better with the other two. So I had Lee Davis paint that one. And here are the two examples. Both are new. So let's get one that ought to be the right, what I think stylistically is the correct one. Here's the last one. It's smaller. It's 26.5 inches. This one's 29 inches, the 8-day. The wagon spring is 29.5, and the Wells is 26.5. The movement is made by Chauncey Boardman. Oh, Boardman and Wells. Oh, and by the way, Chauncey Boardman is J.A. Wells' father-in-law. So there's kind of like a connection there, and you see all three have basically a Wells movement, Boardman and Wells movement. The other thing that I noticed, and that backboard's new on this, is they have this nut on it, and it's not square, and I probably am describing it wrong. I called it a quarter piece of circular brass that because it looks like it's curved and it's cut like it's curved, and you'll find those on 30-hour Boardman weight driven movements. I restored that clock, and I told you I was looking for that movement, and I said when I got it finished I'd bring it. I did, and it is, and it's here. Dial House painted the dial. Now, that's a Boardman and Wells wagon spring. I'm sorry, it's a J.A. Wells wagon spring. J.A. Wells is the only other person making wagon springs during this time with Joseph Ives. And you're going to say, no, you don't know what you're talking about. Atkins made a wagon spring. Yes, he made it later. What you'll notice is they've got three leaves instead of a square-headed bolt. This is a rounded or round-headed bolt. And you're going, okay, well, if it's got a wagon spring and it's got a bolt, it's got to have one of those cast iron bases at the bottom. There's another better picture of the round-headed bolt. They don't have any 4-bun feet because it's countersunk a half an inch down. Well, if you got a 2-inch thick base cutting down a half an inch, you still got 1.5 inches. That's pretty stout. The bracket that holds those intermediate converters, torsion converter wheels, you can see the screw holes, one at the bottom by the J, just to the left of the J and just to the right of the Wells. So when that's on there, all you can read is A. Wells. And the guy who sold it to me says, well, I got an A. Wells clock. Well, glad you think that, but it's not. And then that's in comparison to a 30-hour J. Wells with the Hunt or an Ives. A rounded head compared to square. The other thing is they're not as long. The base plate is shorter on the Wells. You've got more space here than you do over there on the Ives. The springs are just a lot thinner. You lift it up and you can tell it. And that's comparison of the bottom of the two. I told you there's three. I'm going to say the first example is this one here, which is in Ken Roberts' book. It's in a bunch of other books too. It belonged to Anthony Sposata. He had a heck of a collection. The second one is in an article by George Siegel. You can't really see the tablet. I'm going to show you in a second what it is. It's a bird. It's a William Finn bird with medallions above and below. So the one on the left is on the back of his book, and I have it here on stencils, and it's on the back of this book, and that's why he made this one here. He made the etched one with that same eagle so it looked like that, except that they don't go together. And then you have that bird that was in Siegel's book. And those are the only two examples that I knew of, and I only thought existed until I was able to get this one, the one I have. Okay, my last example, so we're running down to the end, is an S.B. Terry 1 second period vertical balance wheel. Beautiful clock. In fact, I can wind it and get a run in, and I should have. That single clock is in 9 different publications. Did they use it in 9 because it was readily available? They had the pictures because it was that good a condition? It was that beautiful? And the answer's yes. Beautifully made. The back plate's solid brass, which you don't usually see. It's got a 3 1/8 inch diameter, 5-spoke vertical balance wheel that's just gorgeous, and it's just smooth the way it runs. And then on the corners you can see the fusee blocks and the fusee cones, and the springs are inside of those wooden blocks in the bottom. Behind that wheel is what is called a yoke. It looks kind of like a yoke. You've got a suspension spring here. Here's the stirrup. It comes down, kind of like a Y. Triangle. Flat on the bottom, comes back up, and it barely touches the wheel. And as a result of that, if you don't have it, it doesn't run. There's the label, S.B. Terry, but it says invented by Eli Terry, and when he did this, he wasn't a spring chick. He was along in age. It says August 9th, 1845, but manufactured by S.B. Terry. And he was only listed at that address from 45 to 46, so could have been done for as little as a year. Very expensive to make, and not many were bought, and not many are around now. I think there's 10. You're asking, how do I know? Because I've got pictures of 9 others. This is the first one. It's got the wrong hands. It's sold at an Otto Schmidt auction. I'm saying it's bought by Delaney because it went to his website, and it was probably sold before it ever got to his website. Second one is in Rare Clocks, Born auction in 1988. Replace the dial, the reverse tablets, the fusee cones, plates, backboard, hands, and gone. That's pretty heavy restoration. I guess something's original. This is from another Born auction, 1987. The same clock was also sold at Skinner's auction in 2012. The glass tablet's old replacement. The fusee blocks have been moved. The second hand is old, but a replacement. Oh, and it's got 30 hour on there. Some of them say 30 hour, and some of them say 8 day. They're not 8 day. And on my clock, when they've advertised it, they said it was 8 day, and they were wrong. This one sold at Skinner's in 2009. So it got the wrong finials. You can tell that by looking at it. Replacement hands. The glass has been repainted. Dial's been relined. No label in the case. I think that would be a biggie. This is one out of Chris Bailey's article from into 2014, and I don't have much. That's all the picture I got. I don't know what's inside, so I don't have much on it. This is the 6th one. The tablet's not right. They're not original, and it's been in a couple of different publications. This one is at National. So if you want an example, it belonged to August Van Dessel, and they have a numbering system, 91.1.2. It doesn't tell me if it's a 30 hour, or an 8-day. It's from, sold by Bourne in '88. It says that the movement was proper for this model, but it's probably not original to the case, as indicated by the extra set of winding holes in the dial, carefully plugged, and replaced seat board. Fusee cones and plates are modern replacements, and hands are replaced. Since I did that, I found a picture of it, and you can see the fusees, instead of being down at the bottom, are up at the top in that little triangular construction. And if you've got that seat board in there, it's different. I think someone jerry-rigged it. This possible conclusion. It's the only one like that. This is the 8th one, and it's from Dr. Baker's collection and is a Bourne auction. Glass tablets replaced, and they tried to copy the one that I have. It's also in ball. The hands are wrong. This is from eBay. It's missing the minute hand, missing the complete fusee block assembly. I mean, there's no fusees in there at all. Missing veneer on the base. And I actually talked to the person later that I found out who owns this, and he tried to make a deal with one of the museums back east that had, he thinks, the fusee blocks, and you could put them together and make one clock, and that hasn't come to fruition. This movement was also in a Empire case, but it's a weight driven, and it has the same vertical balance wheel. So it's the same type of movement, it's weight driven though, instead of fusee. And it sold at a Schmidt auction in 2014. So here are questions, and what I'm going to do, because we're taping it, is I'm going to go ahead and I've got a few references and show those, and I'd be glad to listen because I don't have to think to do this. Anybody has any questions? Sir, David.
Yes. A couple of the pictures that you had of the fusee was without question a fusee because it really had a downward spiral.
Yes.
And I compare this to pocket watches that are a fusee, mainly English-made ones, that have a spiral rate approximately the same. Now, the other pictures that you were showing of a solid core.
I'm listening.
Behind you.
Have a solid core.
The other pictures that you were showing that had a solid core, wooden core, with a very slight taper on it, you were saying, I think, is this a fusee or is it not? Now my question is, the rope or the chain that went around that, what was it? Was it rope? Was it chain? What was?
A lot of the early ones used catgut or gut of some type. Some used Scott, I'm gonna say brass cable. Some used cord. So I think, is there a fourth way to power it? I think those were the three that I think were most common.
What I'm suspecting is, at the small end of that cone, if you can call it a cone, may be the point at where most of the torque was on the chain or the catgut or whatever,
Yep.
and was wearing the wood after many, many years of service. And that the larger end of that cone is possibly the point at which lower torque was applied to it, but that's just a guess on my point, because the cone that you showed that was questionable, I cannot see it as being a Fuji cone. It's just not enough taper.
There's not enough difference between, on this quote, fake fusee, and I'll pick these up so we don't break them. You guys are more than welcome to look at it. I've got them over here. I've got all the references of those 12, and I have, that's a picture of the SB Terry, and that's a picture of the wells. So I'll pass those around. On this fake fusee, the whole reason for a fusee is to equalize the tension on the spring, realizing you started with brass springs, and did they have the same amount of force when it's all wound up as when it got to the end. And the brass springs are really long. They're a lot longer than the steel ones, except in this one, which has the I got these two.
You need help?
Anybody got a bobcat?
The spring, the original spring, one of these got broken. You wind it and it breaks. The original spring is shorter and heavier than the new one, and it runs longer. And you're going, why? And the answer is different tensile strength of the springs. So where you had the wooden one tapered down one direction, and the brass one tapered the other way, did that difference, would that affect the tension? My gut feeling is not very much. I just can't, it's too little, and I can't see it doing it that much. So that's why you call this one a fake fusee, because it's got the wooden, it looks like a sewing thread spool kind of thing, but it is tapered a little bit. Does that come close to answering your question?
Yeah.
Anybody else?
How tall are these?
These are all 22.5 inches, and that's what makes them oversized steeple. Jerome's the only one that made these, is what I came to a conclusion of back in the middle of 2016. And then, a couple months ago, I found that John Taylor wrote an article in '98 on these four, and he had examples of these three. He did not have this one because there's only three. And then this one's in Roberts, you got one in Schaefer's, and you got one that belongs at one time to Dr. Martin Baker. But I've never seen inside the others. The one in Schaefer had is just a lousy picture. I mean, you really can't tell anything from that. So the topic of this is oversized steeples more than 22 inches, 22.5, and then this gets taller based on whether it's 8-day, and these are all 8-day. I've never found a 30-hour in one. These are all 8-day, and they're double fusees. Fusees are located at different places. Burge and Fuller made one where the fusees were located right here about in the middle. These are both Burge and Fuller, a 30-hour and an 8-day wagon spring. And so they're a skosh taller because of the wagon springs are a little bit heavier. 29 inches. And again, if you notice, this has bun feet because of the wagon spring, just like these have bun feet and these have bun feet. This does not have bun feet because it's got
Recessed.
the
Recessed.
recessed countersunk. And I'm going to start this because I think some of you have seen it, but it's worth letting you watch it. Now, while I'm on here and you haven't fallen asleep or your snoring isn't too loud, when you talk about steeple on steeple, steeple on frame, these are steeple on, I call them steeple on steeple. What I call a steeple on frame is also called a candlestick. And in the 8-day, they have 4 candlesticks. And they have 2 on each side, and it's called a double candlestick. On the 30-hour, which is the rarest, they have a single candlestick. And they come in a double fusee. I have not found one that's just in the spring-driven movement with a candlestick. And I have these 3, and at some point I'll make some kind of program on steeple on steeples. Like I said, I'm writing an article on this, and then I'll write a program just on these with a lot more depth. Because I have different examples of the 8-day and the different cases that it came in, the 30-hour and different cases it came in, and different labels. This is the 4-day, and there's just not much out on 4-day. There's one article written 1970. 1970, and the guy said there's only 4 known when he wrote the article in 1970. And then this one, there was an article written in the bulletin in January, and it was in questions and answers. And the question came from JP, because the article says it came from JP. I know that's confusing because you don't know anybody whose initials are JP. And that's probably me. And when I wrote the article, it was in 2014, and they published it in 2017. I'm a little smarter now than I am back then. And I was trying to find out stuff, and this guy, and I wouldn't want his job, said, well, it didn't belong to Ken Roberts because in the 2nd edition, it doesn't say author's collection. When I sent it with the pictures, I said it was from the 1st edition. But the guy who wrote the answer didn't go to the source document. It was also said that it was signed, in the email I got back over 2 years ago, Lee Davis, D-A-V-I-S-E. In the article in January this year, it said Lee Davis. Well, everybody knows Lee Davis. He's an outstanding reverse painter who did the reverse painting for this one. He didn't write it because I called him. I know him. He's a good guy. He says, I didn't write that article. And then a guy named Bob Carter from the UK came out and said, well, I got a question on this, and that's not the only one made, and these other clocks were made, and you need to look up a guy named John Taylor. Well, then it got me in touch with John Taylor, and we started communicating. It's just fascinating.
It ended up being a guy named Lee Davies.
We don't know.
Oh, I thought you did find that out.
They don't know who wrote it. They've put out an errata in the bulletin 2 times ago, not the last one, but the one before that. It said it was not written by Lee Davis of Pennsylvania. Who wrote it? Please come forward. Don't know. Julio. So I'm gonna write this and not go. I was a little defensive when I read that. No, I was a whole lot defensive.
Cranky.
Yeah, I was cranky. So, any other questions, comments? Please look at anything, and if you want to look at anything more, be glad to on anything.
Jim,
And you gotta look at that as front.
I know you can't answer exact, but what's the price range on one of these things?
Which one do you want to buy?
I don't want to buy none of them. That's what I'm saying, though. If I have an opportunity,
General range.
Okay, these, the cheapest is probably this one, and that's probably 800,000. That's probably 900 to 12. These run 15 to 2. And the irony of it is, the 30 hours harder to find than the 8-day,
yeah.
but the 8-day, you'll pay more. In the 8-day, 2 to 3. On the 4-day, on the 4 Jeromes, the 4-day, I haven't seen one. This one sold. I want to say 2 to 3 to 4. This one hadn't sold, so I don't know. Of these two, this is more common, the 8-day. So you can get that probably 8 to 12 on both these. One of these just sold, so these are a little more common. These here are 8 to 10,000.
That leaves me out.
Huh? That little puppy over there is anywhere from, someone said 15 to 20,000.
Wow.
That's probably the most expensive pup. That would be the easiest to resell because everybody knows exactly what it is, and it's in outstanding condition.
Will it be SP Cherry?
Yeah, the SP Cherry.
I got another question for you. I couldn't help but notice the real nice pristine on the wood and everything. It really looks nice. Do you do anything with it, or you just dust them off? Is that all you do, or what?
I've done different things with different ones. I usually use Gojo hand cleaner,
Yeah,
clean all the just black garbage off of it.
yeah.
And then I use an Natchez oil, antique oil.
Yeah.
Scott sells it and lets it soak in. And if you read the instructions, it says you put it on, you leave it for a while, and you wipe it off.
Mm-hmm.
Sandy will tell you I don't do good following instructions.
You're right.
And if it's supposed to feed and soak into the wood,
Mm-hmm.
I'll put it on.
Mm-hmm.
Lay it down, all the way around, and lay it down.
Mm-hmm.
To the front. And I'll come back in an hour or two and look, and where it's all dried out, put some more on. Come back in an hour or two, it's dried out, put some more on. Before I go to bed, I don't leave it overnight.
Yeah.
I'll wipe it off, and then if it's been real dry, I'll start again the next day, and just trying to get it soaked up as much.
Yeah.
And then I've got, it's a blue can of antique paste wax from the UK.
Yeah.
And Scott and I started talking, and I found it, and he's got it, and I like it.
Yeah. Anyhow, the finishes are real nice.
Thank you.
Thank you.
He does work at it.
How many coats of wax do they have on? They've got a few. And these are just, this one I had touched up when I first got it. It had some veneer missing, and I took it to Furniture Medic out by the airport, and they fixed it, and you can't see where they fixed it, but they did a good job. This one came out of an attic. That story I got was a guy was supposed to clean out a house. I mean, family moves, and then somebody pays somebody to go in and just go through everything, get the basement, attic, anything, and just clean everything out. And he saw this clock. And when he saw it, he had the case, it had the dial, it had this right, no, it had this right here. It had all this bottom part. Didn't have a dial, didn't have hands, didn't have these intermediate wheels, didn't have a movement, didn't have a seat board. And that's the one I was going to restore. If there's only 3 of them, it's probably worth restoring. And Scott ended up making these intermediate wheels. I'm blank on his name. Paul Belt made this tie-in bar. The bracket was here. I looked at the movement, and it took me a long time to find the correct movement. It's Boardman and Wells. And I found it. I got a piece of cardboard and traced over it and figured out where the winding arbors were. And then I had hands and sent it to the dial house, and they did it. So that's restored. This is all original. That was all original. This bracket was original. Good question.
Turned out all right.
Yeah, it's, and the case just was black.
Yeah.
But after you cleaned it,
Yeah.
it really was in nice shape.
Yeah.
After you bid on them and had them shipped, and then they came and the tablet was broken because people who shipped them didn't even bother taking the movement out of them, and the movement would shift and go through the tablet and break it. I said, that's ridiculous, and he was interested in some at a Catone auction. I said, that's
October
ridiculous.
17th,
Just-
2014.
Just drive out there. Let's
And
just
I
drive,
bought-
you're interested
Yeah.
in several clocks, just drive out there. Cause this, having them come to the house and then you got broken glass to clean up
Right.
and then you gotta get a new tablet made and that's ridiculous.
And some
Drive
wise
out
person
east.
said, for some of you, collecting watches are easier to carry and
Yeah.
pack and move than it is clocks.
Did you say
And
that
if you get
tonight?
oversized ones like this, I don't plan on moving this many again, hopefully, possibly.
Yeah.
I mean, if you get a wagon spring in them, they're just a little heavy.
Sure.
Yeah, you watch collectors are smart.
If you want to pick up one of those 8-day and you'll figure it out. Try not to, they don't bounce too well.
We got a spring of, right, you're right, they would be heavy, huh?
Mhm.
Going.
Well, that was good.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you for putting up with it.